Okay, we are live. Uh, we today let's start with Ben and then go up.
Okay. So this is actually where I start to diverge from, I think, the Ethereum in that this sort of topic, what they're talking about in the Scourge. Um, and actually, and my personally is moving more in the other direction. Maybe I'll blab that a bit on that. But basically, what they're told this whole thing is about is basically looking at the proof of stake mechanism and trying to basically solve multiple problems, one of which I think is unsolvable in their current structure. Um, but a lot of it's about MEV capture, about who should be the one who constructs blocks. I think I've blabbed about MEV before. I don't. Like I said, I think that yeah, he does at the end say you can try to look at some of this stuff on the app layer. Um, and and look, and I also agree as at some point MEV is unavoidable. Um, and doing proposed and build. So the philosophic point where I think I'm diverging from Ethereum and the Ethereum community is that I think that the base layer should aim to be decentralized as possible. And the layers on top can trade centralization for convenience or speed, instead of trying to make the base layer make trade-offs in that direction. You see this with it's something I'm actually very much disagree with the Ethereum community is block speed, or the average block time. I think they're way too fast already, and they're continually trying to go faster and faster. And and I know why, because if you've ever used Bitcoin, it's a pain in the ass to wait 10 minutes for a block at average, and due to the way the distribution works, you can easily wait an hour for a block, and that's incredibly frustrating. And I think that absolutely needs a solution. I think cranking up the block speed faster and faster, in my mind, the block speed is sort of the thing that's supposed to cover the worst case scenario. So the block time can't be set for the average case or even a slightly bad case. It needs to be the absolute worst case, because if the network connectivity of the world falls below where the block speed is basically the network becomes unstable and collapses. So I think Satoshi was actually right. 10 minutes is a lot better long run than a minute or 6 seconds. So I think 1 or 2 minutes is probably optimal nowadays. Um, but but I said there's a real problem that needs to be solved here, and that is people create a transaction. They do not want to stare at a screen for 10 minutes or more to know if whether their actual transaction was confirmed. And I think, and this goes by the name under the Ethereum community called pre-confs or pre-confirmations. I don't have time to go into all the technical details, but at the end of the day, it's a more centralized sort of solution, but it's centralized in a way that, the thing you're buying for the centralization and control is speed. So, if we're, you may pay a bit more, maybe it's sort of like a semi-centralized entity collection of more centralized entities. You get your transaction pre-confirmed or whatever instantly, you go on with your day. But if that collapses, if, the centralized entities start acting badly and they get banned, or they, get shut down or something, you just go back to playing with the full block time. And that's a pain, but it's different than this network collapsing entirely and then the block time being effectively infinite because you can't get anything confirmed at all. And this comes up again, I think, in other places where I disagree with the philosophy, where they're trying to do stuff that I don't think should be done on the base layer, that needs to be done in something. And they do sort of this with the proposers on roll-ups and block generators on roll-ups, where and so I guess that we do somewhat agree there. Though I could get into that as well, but it's already way too long. The other thing I want to talk about is the stake system, and I think the fundamental problem I think that I've come to the conclusion of with this Ethereum proof of stake system is that the state, ignoring slashing, which as an individual you can always, as long as you don't make a horrible mistake or something's not buggy, you can always avoid. Staking is risk free, and that's really fundamentally different than mining, or proof of work mining. and it's not just because of physicality or electricity prices or anything. It has to do with the fact that in proof of work, and imagine like the next month, there's a fixed amount of reward that's going to be given out, and miners are competing for that. And if and miners as a class can spend more money than the reward that miners as a class will get in. In other words, miners as a class can be unprofitable and lose money. In fact, this happens regularly. As you know, the block, if when the halving happens, some miners are going to become unprofitable. Miners as a class are going to have to change. Um, this, I think, is the fundamental reason why liquid mining has never really existed. It has in forms that really are mostly just scams, cloud mining. But in the end, like compared to like Lido or any of the big LST providers on Ethereum or Solana or the other big proof of stake chains, mining does not generate these incentives to do these big huge LSTs because at the end of the day, it's not risk free. It's possible if too much capital chases the mining sector, everyone loses. Miners as a class just become poorer because basically, as a class, they're buying like with $1 billion, $500 million worth of Bitcoin and losing money. And this is just fundamental to how mining works um, because it's not because the rewards are effectively given are separate from the effort to get them. So the effort to get them can be greater than the reward. Whereas with proof of stake, the effort sort of is in the capital lockup cost. So you could hypothetically lose money that way, but that can be bridged with a with a staking token to where you're not actually locking up any real capital. So your costs are actually zero. And the downside with that system, I think people in Ethereum have basically given up on that. Like, all right, it's fine. Big LST will capture 100% of Ethereum. Um, the problem with that is that turns the proof of stake system into DPoS with extra steps. Cue the Rick and Morty meme. Which, and I dug up Vitalik's old article on this. If you have plutocratic governance is still bad, he talks about all the problems with DPoS. And if everything is sitting in an LST provider and they're effectively voting with some internal mechanism to decide who the actual validators are, then that's just DPoS with extra steps. So I think, and I'm working, and I haven't actually talked to enough people about this because so my idea might have flaws. I think there's a solution to this in the proof of stake method. I think it has something to do with like instead of you put up stake, you gain rewards, and then you can withdraw your stake later. Imagine the network sold like virtual ASIC, and the virtual ASICs decay over time. And so you would buy with ETH or whatever a virtual ASIC, and this would give you virtual mining power, virtual staking power. It doesn't matter what you call it. And you use this, and this eventually goes away. And once it's gone, you don't get it back. So you're buying from the system the right to take part in consensus, and it's not something you ever withdraw. You have to earn your amount back by doing it, and then hopefully a little extra profit. And if something goes wrong and you don't, or everyone tries to do it at once, as a class, everyone will lose money. And I think that's not that's obviously makes mining a lot and staking a lot harder, and that will reduce the amount of ETH involved in the staking process considerably. I think that's okay. I think that actually everyone being involved in the staking process is bad, and that it leads to this sort of DPoS with extra steps. So, and I'm not convinced Ethereum will ever take that because, anyway, I think I already talked for like 15 minutes. Anyway, I don't think there's anything else I wanted to say, and I will pass it up to Anraj.
Yeah, so like I didn't understand a lot of the technical details, but like one thing that I was wondering was like if you want more decentralization, then like individual stakers need like it should be easy for like solo stakers to come in and like start a node. But the last time I tried it, what it was like a really a small headache. And like I play with this stuff on a daily, like I'm an engineer and play with Linux and stuff on a daily basis, and still it was like a headache for me to get the node running properly. So like I don't think like it's still there where like some non-engineer will definitely find it really difficult to like run the node. And like so if like the Ethereum community wants like even non-engineers to start like staking or running nodes. It's still far from there, but I don't know if that level of decentralization is really needed. And like, I think the cost of staking like 32 ETH is still too high, but I think like there are ways to distribute it these days. And yeah, those were some initial thoughts, and then passing on to Anant.
Yeah, thank you. Um, yeah, I think, uh, I mean, outside of this, is wanting to underwrite. I think maybe expecting retail users and non-engineers to run nodes is not a like reasonable expectation to have. I think there are maybe other ways the decentralization vector can be ardent, so to speak. Client diversity comes to mind, and there are probably perhaps other ways of like light nodes and light clients and things like that. That might be a more reasonable path for retail users. The other thing that sort of struck at me reading this was like, I mean, I didn't pay close attention to the title of these series that Vitalik has. It's clearly named it as possible futures. So this is not. I take it, at least from reading this and seeing where the forums are at. This is not sort of like where Ethereum is going. It's sort of like one of the many futures, perhaps. And this, with that in mind, as I was reading through it, it seemed like it's purely sort of constructed to sort of in the to the future where Ethereum is uh, kind of like a finance chain, like a decentralized finance chain, where all of these MEV protections and sort of uh, taking protections and so on and so forth becomes very important. And this is not a world computer sort of, or at least from my perspective, maybe I could be wrong. Maybe it's just a dumb take, but this doesn't seem like a future where Ethereum is acting like a world computer. This seems like a future where Ethereum is acting like a world's settlement layer, which been a sort of a similar narrative in the ecosystem that I've heard before. Uh, the specifics, yeah, I mean, there is always a lot of technical sort of depth to all of these articles and all the links. So I did manage to read some of it, but as always, like there's always more to do. I still do on my own sort of effort to try to run a node. I did spend like an hour or something, like a few weeks ago, but I haven't had a chance to go back to it yet. But maybe I will, and I can comment more on how difficult it is as an engineer adjacent person, perhaps. Uh, yeah, I mean, the last part of the article on, I mean, there's a shout out to CoveSwap, which I would love to sort of learn more and probably do a reading on that. But it seems like there's some parts of these issues, like MEV protections issues, could be handled off chain. Like CoveSwap is one way, and there's probably other ways that you can do it. So I don't know how much of, again, like I said, this assumes a feature of like Ethereum being a settlement chain, and I'm not sure if that is that is where things will go. But I'll stop there and I'll pass it to Venkat.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have much to say because if you think about like a pyramid of levels of abstraction and how much detail there is at each level, this is a very bottom heavy pyramid. Like 90% of what there is to think about is in the bottom layer. So it's like not only is the devil in the details, the devil is like 90% of the discussion here. So it's not a level at which I feel competent to dive into or either interested or willing to gain the competence. So I'm kind of like thinking, what's the spectator or manager view of this problem? And I think the two aspects of it that interest me are calibration of the scale of the problem, which will determine sort of the thresholds required to solve it. And then the macro version of what Anuraj and Anant pointed out, which is things like, the difficulty of retail users actually doing anything with any of this. Okay, so boundary conditions. I don't think there's an absolute threshold for performance bounds on these things. Like, how quickly should blocks be chosen? What should be the cost or time plus money burden for validating a block? Those, like, it's not about 10 minutes or 6 seconds or whatever it is. You kind of have to derive those kinds of numbers from the ultimate vision you're shooting for. So with Ethereum, I think it's useful to work backwards from, what do they call it, like billion user Ethereum or something like that, like some ridiculous number that represents a fraction of humanity that kind of uses Ethereum on a routine basis and at a routine frequency, right? So the answers you'll come up with when you say that, like, a billion people, which is like a third of adult humans, which you can think of, if you divide up the adult population of the world properly, you let out really young people and really old people, perhaps, or maybe you leave out middle-aged and old people, and this is maybe a young people's game. But in some segment of the world population, this would be 100%, right? So 100% of some meaningful demographic, like say the peak working age population is perhaps using Ethereum like 200% level. So it's not like cell phones where it's literally almost 100% of humans, but it's that level of penetration. So that's one boundary condition you can think of. The second boundary condition you can think of is, what are they doing with this, which determines like the frequency of transactions and stuff. Are they buying coffee with it? Are they doing Bitcoin-like things where it's like a gold-like investments, and at most they're like buying or selling the way they rebalance their stock portfolios? So maybe a couple of times a year if they're retail people, and more frequently if they're like institutionally moving gold or Bitcoin around. So what kind of transactional environment is Ethereum? And my sense is, again, that it's not like B2B SaaS level calibrated like Solana, but at the same time, it's not like occasionally rebalancing your portfolio like Bitcoin. It's somewhere in between. And I think the right calibration is probably credit card transactions. Like if this stuff becomes like, suppose things work out and all these problems get solved and it hits the vision levels, what you're going to end up with is Ethereum is going to be part of like an identity system like your driver's license or passport. It's going to be part of maybe a proxy transactional system, like maybe an AI agent that you delegate authority to is making perhaps dozens of choices while you're browsing. So maybe it's plugged into your browser and it's doing stuff to, I don't know, do micropayments to websites, or like buy little tokens to read Substack articles, things like that, right? So you get the kind of like type of transaction I'm calibrating against. So if you take these things that, like, billion plus people are using it, they're using it at a frequency of like maybe dozens of times a day, maybe dozens to hundreds of times a day, but not millions or billions. And they're using it at a retail level for, I would say, like a proxy level of transaction. So you won't ever be thinking explicitly of, is this worth like, I don't know, 0.01 ETH, and is the gas price too much and is the slippage too much? You'll not be making decisions at that level. Instead, you'll be declaring your preferences in almost like a CSF level, where you say, these are the limits I'm willing to live within. This is how much you should bid. This, beyond this limit, trigger human in the loop intervention, something like that. And then AI agents or something equivalent will be making decisions all the time. So within these boundary conditions, you have to ask, all right, this kind of stuff like MEV and managing this conflict, what is the level at which you should manage it down to, right? So this is a question like, urban planners have to decide how much crime is too much crime, how much pollution is too much pollution, how much homelessness and garbage in the cities, too much homelessness and garbage, right? And the answer is never zero. Like if you look at these macro problems, it is simply not worth the effort to like get the last crazy homeless guy off the streets, but it's worth getting enough off the streets that regular people can just walk on the sidewalks, right? Like at one point, parts of San Francisco were so bad you couldn't walk on the sidewalk because like any randomly chosen half-mile walk in San Francisco, you'd have to like cross the street a couple of times to avoid like a crazy homeless person who might attack you, right? That's too much. So that gives you a calibration sense, right? So you've got this boundary conditions of like aggregate volume of people and frequency of transactions. So the number of people times frequency of transactions is the load the system has to handle. And then there's some like macro level percentage of what is the average burden of suboptimality threats that the retail person has to pay for, because all this can be converted into a tax, right? Like running into one homeless person per mile is like a tax. Say it takes you 20 minutes to walk a mile and you're like, making 10 turns along the way. And at one point you have to cross the street to avoid a crazy homeless person. That's like a 5 to 10% tax. And I'm deliberately using this extremely politically loaded, but soft and social sort of example as calibration, because that's the sort of thing I think we're dealing with, right? Because people will disagree about like how to humanely deal with homeless people, what is your moral or civic duty to do, what's the duty of the city and stuff like that. But honestly, most of us will just say, it's not my problem, I don't want to deal with it, I'm crossing the street, and then I'm going to complain if it gets to be too much and move out of the city if it's beyond reasonable, right? So yeah, any of these problems can be converted to a tax. So think of it as like, sales tax or octroi or something like that. It's like assuming you're spending like the equivalent of say $50 a day on the Ethereum infrastructure system, doing all the things in your life. Maybe $50 is maybe too much. Maybe, $10, I don't know. How much tax are you willing to pay, right? So there's the transaction fee, which is the base. There are no problems, just you kind of have to pay to get the system running, kind of like transaction fee. That's very low. So that's, modeled by the current gas thing. But then what's the additional tax you're willing to pay in order to secure the system against these classes of threats? Is it 5%? Is it 10%? Is it the case that at some point you'll think, hey, this is valuable enough, I'm willing to pay income tax levels of tax to secure the system, which in the US gets calibrated between 20 to 50%. And that's not actually out of the question, right? It could be that in the future, Ethereum will become so valuable and so sad. Like maybe the only way you can make a lot of money and have like a good sort of like working life is if you work in the Ethereum system, and then you'll treat it as this is my living, and therefore I shouldn't complain if the tax level is kind of like income tax, because that's what happens when you pay income tax, right? The federal government takes a cut, the state government takes a cut, the city government takes a cut. You pay layers of taxes in order to earn a living. And Ethereum is like a city you're living in, so it's yet another. So it's a virtual layer in the stack of environments you inhabit in order to make a living. So it'll be like the city, like, you're already seeing that with pop-up cities and stuff. And then you ask, what's the quote unquote virtual pop-up city tax I'm willing to pay in order to like live in the Ethereum economic system and earn a living? Maybe you're willing to deal with 5-10%, right? So I think this is kind of the bounding box of how to think about these problems. And without these, any numbers you make up are kind of like, everybody's got an opinion type of pointlessness. And I think what will end up happening is competing systems like this will make different choices about what the appropriate levels are. And people will like, do exit and voice to choose and self-select into different virtual economic environments. So some people will choose Bitcoin and do very little. Some people will choose Solana, which will be very secured, but kind of like limited in its capacity, and they'll do the equivalent of taking like, a big corporation job. Some people will live in the Ethereum world and be like free agents, having an economy. Maybe Ben will invent something and that'll attract a different population of people. So it'll kind of like be how people self-sort into economic environment. So my point is, this is not purely an engineering problem with a right answer, in the sense of, like, early evolution of airplanes, people didn't know how many wings a plane should have. Should it be a monoplane, a biplane, triplane? There were crazy people who were like coming up with plane designs with like 10 levels of wings and stuff. So that was a different kind of problem because it converged to a single engineering solution where 99% of the planes in the world have a monoplane structure, a single lifting surface, for whatever reason. I don't know the full reasoning why that turned out to be the converged optimum. I don't think this is one of those design spaces. I think here you will find several sort of like design pockets, and people will handle them differently. Yeah. Anyway, so I'm getting at here. There's there's that to think about, and then the specific solutions that Ethereum is pursuing. I do get the sense of, yes, it's like there's a baroque level of complexity, and there's a slight risk of it snowballing into like truly Byzantine levels of administrative complexity that gets so hard it becomes intractable, and like there's a mismatch between the billion Ethereum users' goal and the complexity of the system you're using to try and get there. So there's a possibility of an impedance mismatch there, and I think people like Vitalik are kind of alive to that, and they kind of like seem to talk like that. But of course, there's a risk that they get trapped in their own bubble, and it's like Vitalik talking to three other geniuses, and they think it'll work, but when they try to roll it out, it never happens. So light clients never get solved. It never gets simple enough to roll out to a billion, and at some point it stalls out. So that's definitely a risk. On the other hand, it could be that this will eventually work out because there's a lot of like similarly complex systems that exist at global scale that billions of people rely on, but very few people actually understand. Like the healthcare system is an example. Like billions of people rely on the healthcare system for like basic provisioning of health services. Most of us have no idea of the complexity of stuff involved in the pharma industry, healthcare delivery, surgery, managing pandemics. But as we saw during COVID, huge infrastructure kicked in and kind of saved the day, right? So it could be that this will remain forbiddingly complex, and there will be like a huge stack of professional experts dealing with 90% of it. And retail people occasionally will have to deal with it, and it'll be super frustrating, just like going to the hospital is super frustrating these days. But if you're quote unquote healthy, your normal life is manageable. And I think this could end up that way. Like if your Ethereum life is quote unquote healthy, it'll be like paying an annoying tax, but you'll be fine most of the time. But occasionally you'll have like an exceptional problem, and you'll have to deal with the equivalent of the hospital bureaucracy. And it could be that, surgery and interventions won't save you. Like maybe you suffered a big hack that wipes you out, or your identity gets stolen. So there will be that kind of situation. Anyway, sorry, hopefully that was useful calibration on like the macro frame to think about this. I think after me is Jenna, sorry. Yeah.
Jenna, you are on mute if you're saying something.
Thank you. I thought I hit it, but I didn't take. Test, test, test. Good. My stuff is just a quick side rail for what Venkat was saying, because what has been catching my eye ongoingly about all of this stuff is the fundamental language problem involved, in that it's a true problem. They're inventing new things, which necessarily involves language invention. Saying words that never existed, that with new meanings, and inventing words that didn't exist before. But also then there is some Kabul in-group stuff that happens, of course. So I'll drop the link, but there was a fun conversation about this on Farcaster 5-6 days ago. And people were making kind of this point. So for this crowd, which phrases really need to be these sort of technically used ones, and which words they could actually shift and start using more kind of public-facing, user-friendly, words that the billions will understand. That was one thread there. The other thing that's just really on my mind about this is the aircraft carrier really is already at sea, and they're still having to build it, right? Like there's already billions of dollars on the thing while they continue to build it out. That's just an amazing problem. And then, in addition, they're building a collaborative decision process as well. So we're talking about how should we change the aircraft carrier while it's already at sea underway. And then the third piece that's just, and this has come up over the years on Yak Collective calls in a way that's I find just fun. That there's just this basic reminder of that arc of something that seems really complex. After sufficient exposure, suddenly it's not. It's like, oh yeah, I get that. So I'm waiting for my my brain to do that on this. But I also saw a really nice post on Mastodon, which I continue to check once in a while. A person posted something about how electronics used to be super hard 10 years ago, and suddenly now they aren't anymore. So it's just a good reminder of how our brains grapple with complexity over time. And then, so the C voice thing is going on. I just, so before I pass it back to the group, apparently I'm going to get a DM, and if somebody else had an alternate meeting summation AI generator thing they were curious to use, I'd be happy to pass that along to that person. And then, for you, Granola is doing a transcription under the hood. It doesn't make it publicly facing for, I think, probably legal reasons. So we can also port that over to something. But if anybody has questions or wants to stay on the call for a minute or two after noon, we can chat about that. Passing back to the group. Oh, and otherwise, I guess I'll do the granola summation for today, unless somebody wants to jump in.
3 minutes left. More comments? If not, then we end here and we meet in 2 weeks. Thank you.